So welcome to week 12. This is the part 5. We're going to cover 3 chapters this week, chapter 16, 17, and 18. They're relatively short chapters. And then around 9:30, the quiz will be opened up. And before then, we'll do as we've done on the past quizzes. We'll kind of review some of those questions and answers beforehand. The bulk of the questions are actually from today, so hopefully it'll be fairly fresh on your mind from what we had compared to last week or the week before um, for that. I want to switch over before we start to just go over to the water book page on my website. I'm going to scroll all the way to the bottom. I'm going to do this kind of quickly and make everybody a little dizzy. And just go over a couple of recent updates that I've added in just so that you're aware of what's happening. So starting from the bottom, this Water for Life was a really interesting film that's out. You can see it, I think, online. And there's 3, I think it focuses on 3 advocates in Latin America. One was killed related to water resources. And the issue is, as we've covered in this course, industrial use of water compared to indigenous or local or community use for water. That fight can sometimes turn violent, and that's what the movie's about. So there's I think I forgot, there's other countries involved and things like that. So just an interesting thing. You can read, you can watch the video or see the details on it there. Just today and yesterday, I learned of a process that's in the military known as line of effort. And Ted Halpin's a member of the International Association of Emergency Managers, answered a question that somebody had on our internal sort of equivalent of Facebook. We have a posting site where members can post questions and answers to other members on IAEM. And the question came up about dam failures, and Ted said he had some information. So he's put together an infographic and a whole sort of 1,500 word type of response on the idea of line of effort modeling in emergency management planning and execution. I thought it was really good. And since it had a piece about dam failures, I asked if I could include it in here. He said yes. So I put it up there today. And then here's a series of billion-dollar weather information. I think this is about where we left off last week, but I'll just reiterate it again. This is pretty cool. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration has time series. So between 1980 and 2025, with the consumer price index adjusted for that inflation and all that kind of stuff. These are your storms and the overall costs and things like that. So this is one of those crazy graphics that you can use to help justify why you should be doing preparedness and mitigation work, because every dollar that we do towards that saves these dollars 6 to 12 to 18 times, depending upon how much you're looking. But these are your categories of what it is: winter storm, drought, flooding. As you can see, a number of these are water related for that. So it's not an unusual thing for, actually, I think almost all of them are. So that's that. And then there's unadjusted and all that kind of stuff you can do as well too. But big stuff. And then there's that Manville story. I remember I talked about that last week, but I just wanted to again point out those line of effort in that movie thing. I thought were kind of interesting. And again, I've been adding these information. You can just start at the top, start at the bottom, wherever you want. And this is stuff that's not in the book, basically, is what it amounts to. But so back to the book and the lecture. We're going to again cover water treatment plant issues, saltwater intrusion, and ice dams and frozen lakes today. Here are the slides. And if you want to play along while I'm going through this, it's not a bad idea to have this up and running. It'll probably be easier for you to look at it on your own screens, to sort of toggle back and forth between than for me to switch out in and out. So, but let me show them to you quickly in the beginning, because the color versions of these are, in this case, in these chapters, much more valuable than the black and white versions. So here we are in our standard water hazards, and the chapters 16, 17, and 18. This first one is the idea of how the flow goes from stormwater, wastewater, atmospheric rain and stuff from the sky. Basically, this is how the water flows from effectively what we have as threats to what could be potential hazards and impacts. So I thought it was pretty cool, a nice simple graphic to describe stormwater runoff, where the bodies of water that get stuff and give stuff depending upon, this is a normal process is what we're talking about here, not any kind of slosh or tropical storm or dam breach. This is the way that the water flows in a system in most urban and suburban areas. This is where we are in most parts of New Jersey for that. And then this is an interesting case. This was the San Juan Chama drinking water project, Albuquerque, New Mexico, right on the Rio Grande. And I'll go into this in much more detail in the case, but I think looking at the graphic and zooming in on it and all that is really helpful, because obviously the arrows, they're pointing in directions, but the color helps too to figure out what's happening. I think, and by the way, this is a quiz question. One of the interesting things about this process that they have here is they actually have like an exit for where the fish can avoid getting sucked up into the treatment plant, the processing plant of the water, moving from wastewater effectively and downstream, and then fresh water upstream. But the fish tend to swim upstream. That's what they do. So that's all there. And this was an interesting project. It is active. It is working now, and something that they did, which is pretty cool, I thought. And I'll go into the case on that a little bit more in detail while we talk about that chapter. And then this is a graphic from, I believe it's Oregon. This is something that they've been pushing out, the idea that you need 14 gallons to support you for 2 weeks per person. That's the water that you would need for drinking, basically. So that's just a reminder to have that water available and figure out how to get it from whatever sources that you need for that. And then finally, this is I think it's finally, just let me check. Yep, finally. Finally, this is a map, a Google map of Mackinac Island up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. The interesting thing to note about that is that Interstate 75 from Mackinac City, very different than Mackinac Island. As you can see, they're actually spelled differently too. But that's just connects parts of one part of the Upper Peninsula to the other, but does not, I repeat, does not have any kind of infrastructure, bridges, et cetera. There's no tunnels, of course, but no bridges go to Mackinac Island. That island is specifically designed not to have any motor vehicles on it because they don't have any bridges to go to it. So they use ice bridges, and we'll go over that in a bit. It's an interesting community, and the emergency planning for that is complex, and that's part of the case. So and that's it. So then next week is cyber attacks. That'll be the very last chapter of the book, and any material from that will be covered in the final quiz. There isn't a separate quiz for chapter 19, which is the last chapter in the book, as I said. So that's that. So I will switch back now over to the actual book itself. All right. So we're first off talking about chapter 16, water treatment plant issues. We've certainly covered the threat aspect to water treatment plants. And what happens if they get flooded? What happens if they don't have enough water? This is where there are effectively threats and hazards generated by the water treatment plant. So think of it that way. It's not that the ocean water or the fresh water is causing a problem at the water treatment plant. It's the reverse. The water treatment plant's doing something that's causing a problem in the community. That's the way to look at this chapter, or this section, I should say, of it's a chapter. So the first thing, of course, is chlorination. The amount you put in can be, is a critical, almost an art, but it certainly is a science as to how much. So looking at that, and focusing on how much is really needed is a critical element. Too much of it, and the water will come out burning, from the faucets. Too little, and it doesn't protect against the pathogens that it's designed to eliminate. Here's that graphic showing the systems and structures. Again, if you need to see it in color, it's really much better to look at. There aren't any quiz questions, I don't think, related to the graphic, like what flows into what, so don't sweat that part of it, but I just think it's an easier look in color. Next off is the finished water and storage and distribution systems. So raw water and potable water, they get stored in places, tanks and things like that as part of a water systems, underground reservoirs, etc. They can be towers. That's the common thing people recognize. I think off of 35, there's a big tower, that kind of thing. And then, of course, then in many parts of the country and the world, there are open waterways, aqueducts, and so forth. And where they are and how they're connected, how they're interconnected, those can all have threats and hazards for them as well too. The hazards being if something's not moving in the right direction, and we'll have some cases for that. There can be issues for that. And then, of course, as I mentioned, physical and cyber threats can cascade directly, connect these interconnects and water storage. Those are the concerns and issues. And there's a lot of good footnotes and resources if you wanted to get more on some of those items. And then when it comes to water and energy, certainly the idea of nuclear power is reliant on water to cool it in most cases. But it's the hydroelectricity that this is really focused on. There are so many communities that rely on hydro electricity. So the idea of water at a higher level, gravity going through it, and then that turns turbines, all that kind of stuff. That's the energy generation. Basically, as the sentence says, hydroelectricity is 100% dependent on water. No water, then there's no hydroelectricity. And then there's a quote here about sort of when you have multi-countries and other issues in some of that. And then, of course, the carbon, the ozone emissions and all those kinds of things are concerns as well, too. So here's our case examples. And the first is that Albuquerque water system I mentioned. So for years, they were doing groundwater pumping and aquifer depletion. So they were not utilizing that Rio Grande River that's next to them. They were pulling their water just from the groundwater. That was, in their minds, going to be unsustainable in the long term. So they created this project to make it basically usable for generations to come. There's emergency management elements in there, as I mentioned, and lots of functionality that helps. What if the one tower fails, or one processing pit or bin or area? They've got backups to that. So that's part of it. And again, as I mentioned, natural occurring arsenic removal. That was one of the things we talked about in the very beginning of the book, about how there's like these hard elements that can be hazardous to humans, arsenic being one of them. And as I mentioned, fish passage, aquifer recharge, in other words, replenishing the natural aquifer, dealing with any kind of surface water treatment. They have the same issues there if they put for some reason, well, they don't do a lot of road salt in New Mexico, but if they have, fertilizers, other things that pesticides, whatever people are putting on their lawns and stuff like that, you got to be able, that surface water is going to come off when the runoff goes into the drainage. All that has to be dealt with so that it's cleaned out. They're looking at all that. They looked at all that in the totality. So this abcwua.org website has much more detail on it. But if you were looking at a quiz question, fish passage would be the one to focus on. And then there's a case of in the U.S. Virgin Islands, and this is fairly recent, 2023. This was happening while I was writing the book. And think of it as a complete opposite of what happened in Flint, Michigan. In Flint, Michigan, the lead was exasperated or brought out or the issues from it came from the switch from one type of water to another with an interconnected system. They switch from interconnecting one source to another. The acidity, the whatever it is, I don't even know. I honestly don't know what it was. Something in that water was causing the lead to leach into the drinking water in Flint, Michigan. In the U.S. Virgin Islands, they don't have interconnects. So when they discovered lead in their potable water supply, it's a big concern. How did they get there? Where is it coming from? What do they do? How do they back around it? This got to the level that a federal emergency declaration, not a disaster declaration, but an emergency, so that second lower level of it, was declared in 2023 by President Biden, and then basically activated FEMA and other entities, EPA and others, to do testing, to do potable water distribution, all that sort of thing. I think they are working on doing household storage unit and treatment using ultraviolet light for decontamination. That's something that's very common in other Caribbean nations that have the infrastructure, meaning that they have the physical and dollars to support the UV light decontamination. It's also common in the Middle East and in other places as well too, Asia, etc. Next up is Jackson, Mississippi. So the year before that, Jackson lost its main water treatment plant, and this was a major failure, and it also lowered the water pressure. So this was exactly what we've been talking about in prior chapters. They lacked firefighting capability right away in Jackson, Mississippi. Now that is the state capital, as I mentioned. And so unfortunately, the state was very slow to supporting and assisting. I think there might have been opposite political parties. I don't know that part, but there were issues. And so they had boil water threat hazards. This was a disaster that went on for months. And then they ended up getting outside assistance, but that takes time and funding and coordination, as I note there. So failing to solve this problem, as I'm going to read this just directly, whole of government solutions, not just emergency management courses of actions. This hit all of their recovery support functions, including, of course, economic recovery and resiliency. So a lot to that for Jackson, Mississippi. And then there's a quick side note box here about the beer company switching to canned waters. This is the one you hear about, and it's not just Anheuser-Busch, but they're probably the biggest one that does this. I actually have one of their cans behind me of canned water. I got that from a flooding disaster that I was in Houston, Texas, a few years back. But basically they can switch, and that's something that that can be a resource. That's part of that whole community response. That's part of that non-governmental support. Usually what Anheuser-Busch does is it donates it to the American Red Cross, and then the American Red Cross distributes it as it's needed on disasters. Turning that on, of course, is a logistics challenge in itself, and is not something they do, at a drop of a dime kind of a thing. Next up is a sovereign tribal nations example where the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs in Oregon got help from 2 U.S. federal agencies to fund and build a water treatment plant. So this was from both the Indian Health Service and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. That was a $23 million project and to draw water for the river and then replace a plant that was built in the early 80s. So good stuff there, and a strong collaboration between multiple entities at different areas and levels. Next up is the big one, as I said, very bad one. For the actual case that I have, short, it's not the full story, but it's a sort of a summary of it, of what happened in Flint, Michigan in 2014. And then, was resolved, was identified or uncovered in 2016. So that is the case where the switch from the water um, from Lake Huron to Flint River, and this switch, by the way, was done purely for financial reasons. One was costing too much compared to another, and so they they switched it. And unfortunately, by switching that, they generated this lead problem throughout the city of Flint, and there was massive amounts of health concerns, predominantly in children, that resulted from this. And you can see on the chapter what those are. So this is an ongoing problem and concern even to this day. And they've had to redo piping, add filter systems. I don't believe they're still on bottled water per se, but the trust and confidence in government in this community is at a low. So this is where also I should note that that you'll hear, if you look and read in things, you'll see things where they'll say emergency manager did this, this, and this. In Michigan, that's a term for a fiscal manager, not an emergency manager like we all are. That's somebody who just is in charge of the finances. We've been trying to get Michigan to change the wording of this because it's obviously confusing. You could have a town that has a standing emergency manager, but then when the mayor and council don't do the right thing, the governor can install an emergency fiscal manager. So, very strange. But that a fiscal manager is called an emergency manager. So very, very confusing. I think, as I say it here, I'll state it. I stated it for the record, right? True emergency managers in a community, including their PIOs, their public information officers, need to distance themselves from emergency fiscal managers as to what they do, how they serve the public. I'm not saying don't work together, but don't try to confuse, don't try to be the same person. Don't try to connect yourselves to those dots, because that fiscal manager really should be called a fiscal manager. I got confused looking at everything and seeing, emergency managers are doing this. I mean, why? That sort of thing. And then next up is a water systems quality issue in the United Kingdom, the UK. They have some issues, the same kinds of things with lead. They were using brass fittings brought together with lead solder, and that created a problem. They are doing 8 million buildings in the UK. This is a project that is still going on. They're also looking at river contamination in the UK, and that is a concern that they have there. So details on those two are in footnotes 25 and 26. Next up is that Portland, Oregon Regional Water Providers Consortium. This is some really good information about, again, what to do for preparedness. They are very concerned over there in Oregon about an earthquake, a catastrophic earthquake on the Cascadia fault line. If that were to happen, they would lose their infrastructure. They firmly believe that's the case. That they will have no pipes for water. All of that will get broken and whatever else. So they need to get as many people prepared in advance. And so they put this information out in 14 different languages, including English, for that. So pretty comprehensive and yet simple messaging. So that's it for the cases for this particular one chapter, but then the impacts to the disaster phase cycles are fairly similar to what we saw in parts 3 and 4. It's similar to when you have other threats to the water systems and water quality issues, certainly can be the case. So looking at that and focusing on those in terms of your response, your recovery, and of course beforehand to have this information like you saw with Oregon of getting everybody ready for alternatives if needed. In terms of mitigation, it's unusual, and again, looking at what's happening, I just I just heard something the other day, yesterday or the day before, the feds may be raising the per capita minimums for public assistance declarations on disaster declarations to 8 times what they are now. So again, all of this in terms of status for grants and or disaster declarations is really something we'll have to review again in 2026 to see how it all fleshes out this year in terms of what changes and what doesn't change, that sort of thing. And then from the command, incident command system, the ICS, again, safety officers looking at water quality issues, the issue if people have respiratory or other immune system compromises, dealing with a contaminated water supply is may not be the best thing. Those pathogens, if they're getting through because of lack of chlorination, for example, those are the concerns for your own teams, is what I'm trying to say, that may be responding. And then again, the PIOs have the same kind of messaging related to distribution. Same issues that we saw before. If you're doing a point of distribution, when you're announcing it, describe what kind of water you're going to be issuing. Are you issuing it in bulk, meaning somebody's got to bring their own container? Is it coming in 1 gallon bottles? Is it coming in 2-liter bottles? Those are the kind, 1 case, 2 cases, you have to show ID, whatever the sort of rules of the road are. That kind of messaging is critical for public information officers to get out to avoid any kind of conflicts or threats and hazards at the point of distribution sites. People are coming by bus and they're not bringing a container. They're going to be very disappointed if that's how the water needs to be distributed to them. And then liaison officers, again, you may be seeing them from the water systems or the wastewater treatment plants. You may have liaison officers or LNOs from federal agencies, such as the U.S. Department of Environmental Protection. There also may be, if there is a declaration, you'll have a whole federal structure that should still be out there in terms of supporting the state and their actions. When I say state, I mean tribal or territorial also. Intelligence, again, understanding where this is, where the hazards are, where the plants are, how they're impacted. Those are some of the critical aspects for Chapter 16. And then, of course, the financial side of it is very similar to the quality issues that we had in prior chapters as to who's paying for what, who's responsible, that sort of thing is part of this. So added filters, who's covering that. What happens if the chlorination impacts health? Those are issues that maybe end up in the courts. I don't know. But the point being is that keeping an eye on this and your own teams and managing the costs, documenting them, et cetera, for possible reimbursement, either through a court case, an insurance policy, or possibly through federal support or state support, if that's where it comes out. Then logistics, of course, we talked about the pods thing from before. So this is the same as that before in the prior chapters related to any kind of potable water distribution. And then just keeping track of those donations if they came as donations. If the water company's donating it, if the local, as I said, Anheuser-Busch or other beer distributors are switching over to canned water, and donating them, documenting all that and managing it through your logistics process is all part of the paperwork that you need to do anyway. We talked about firefighting being impacted. That was from the Jackson case as an example, when their treatment plant went down and they lost pressure to their hydrants. That was a concern. And then planning, again, don't think there's any specific hazards impacts to the planning cycle or the planning elements. But again, that battle rhythm, that operational tempo will be longer. As you saw with Jackson, it was months. And for Flint, it's been years. So here's our POET stuff. We're looking for the plans, what the emergency plans are for those water treatment plants, having conversations all the way at the end, looking at the exercises, exercising together, what staff is doing what, how are they deployed, how are your teams going to be if you're bringing in outside folks that may or may not be familiar with your community, and how it's interconnected on water systems. Those are all things that you have to look at for this, and have as much information available to folks as you can. The equipment, what do you have? What's on your critical infrastructure list? What is your resourcing that you have for equipment through logistics? And then, of course, training is pretty standard. There is a National Infrastructure Protection Plan course. I have a link to that. That's a pretty good course to take. All of them are good. But the reference for that is at 31. I think that's a TEACS class. Let me just quickly jump over there and see what that is. Nope, it's an IS 860. So that's an independent study course from FEMA. And I believe it is still out in there and running. I want to just check it. Yep, National Infrastructure Protection Plan and Introduction. So easy peasy. This course is 2 hours, not a long course, but a really good one to look at how the nation looks at critical infrastructure to include the private sector and government at all levels. Let's see where I'm at. Okay. So that is pretty much the poetic. And as I mentioned about the exercising, bringing all the different groups in is really helpful. And don't just exercise response. Look at how you're dealing with the communications plans. Is the water treatment, is the water company saying 25 gallons and the OEM is saying 14 gallons, needed for 2 weeks? Get that all lined up. Practice that out. Who's giving out what messages? What languages are they in, and how do we distribute them? And the timing schedules for those kinds of things. That's all easy stuff that can be done in an exercise that really helps a full cycle. So again, standard sort of stuff on the chapter summary here. Complex incidents are just that. They're complex. They can be both quality and quantity. So looking at that is critical. Let's see. So next up is saltwater intrusion into navigable fresh waters. There's a question. Let me see what we got in the chat. I'm sorry. Oh, hi, Mitzi. Fire management. Yeah. That is cool. The individual declaration threshold was 877,000. Oh, wow. So Mitzi, can you share with us how much that fire management assistance grant was? You can say no.
Well, no, we don't know how much. I mean, we're working on the costs. We created the job number to track, personnel.
Okay.
Forest Fire Service is tracking down, the equipment used in order to calculate, that cost.
Gotcha.
The Army National Guard with a couple Blackhawks with, buckets attached in order to, help with that piece of it for fire suppression.
Right.
But, it's just starting to put the costs together in order to understand how much was spent or is being spent on this incident. And
an FMAG is different than a emergency or a presidential disaster declaration, right? It's not quite Stafford. Is that a good way to describe it?
No, I mean it is still referenced off of it, but
okay.
It's different. So no, it doesn't need to go through. So we were able to get the approval through the FEMA Region 2.
Gotcha.
But we still have to. We got the verbal. But we still have to put the information together to make sure that we do qualify under the individual, which is 877,000 and change. The cumulative threshold is like 2.3 million. So okay. Bundle all the wildfires, brush fires together, and the costs to say, hey, do we meet the $2.3 million threshold for a declaration on that?
Oh, so you have the same kind of thing as a snow thing. It's got to be worse than the worst one you've ever had.
Something like that, yeah.
Okay, sorry. And then is there a 25% cost share match on these FMAGs?
Yes, so it's a 75-25. but
Okay.
something is better than nothing.
And don't forget that I know the Red Cross set up a shelter, 300 plus people, I think were supported overnight. Those hours and any kind of donated materials should be able to be utilized against that 25%.
Yeah, so we'll be having a kickoff meeting, OEM, and
Yeah.
they'll
Well,
be coordinating with the
tell Coletta
counties.
to remember to ask Eddie for the for the numbers.
Yeah, but yeah, we'll start looking and compiling all that. I mean, we're looking at compiling the stuff for DEP and Forest Fire Service,
Sure.
as far as those kinds of resources and assets. But then, there's the county and the local that NJOEM will need to pull together for those.
Yeah,
pieces.
you have volunteer fire departments that helped with it. All that kind of stuff counts. Yeah, it's
And we did reach out to the potentially impacted infrastructure, so water and wastewater. Luckily, none of them had anything that was any impacts of, say, value. So
That's good.
It was more inconvenience, but it's something that yes, we have to go and look at all that as well.
So you didn't have to do any boil alerts or anything from that, in other words.
No,
Okay.
no, luckily.
Hey, Michael, thank you for that. Oh yeah, well, look at this. So here's some interesting stuff. Yeah, I'm glad you guys got this. Is great. This is helpful. I think this is going to interconnect you guys all together on this. If all the cards line up right, the next book on the series will be fire. So I will be sure to include this as a case for it. I'm glad to hear no one was injured, as far as I can tell, or worse from the fire, including responders, of course. That's always good news. I know this was a national news story. I was in Omaha, Nebraska when I saw it. Although I actually think it started before I left, because I think it was this thing kicked off Monday or so, I believe, last week. Trying to remember when, and I was surprised to find out that it appears to be arson as the root cause. That's unusual, I think. Tuesday morning. Thanks, Heidi. Yeah, that's when I flew out to Omaha on Tuesday, and then on Thursday night we had a tornado there in Omaha. And of course, what did I do? I wasn't near the window, but I didn't go into the shelter. I'll tell you that. So, but I was there with the with 7 other emergency managers from across the country, and we were all trying to figure out what was going on and help others, I guess, is the easier way to look at it. But we didn't end up doing anything. All right, thanks. That's really cool stuff. I appreciate that. Good things. So next up is saltwater intrusion. And by the way, if anybody has any questions, just throw them in the chat or shout them out, whatever works. Speaking of air flights and stuff, I'm flying from Omaha into Chicago, and I'm watching that little computer screen, right, that has the thing where it says, how high are you up in the air, and because I can't see out the window where my seat was, I couldn't see where we were. And finally we touched down, and I'm looking, and it still says we're 600 feet in the air. I'm like, what do you mean, how are we 600 feet in the air? Then I realized it's 600 feet over sea level, because I Googled it, of course. So Chicago's around 600 to 700 feet above sea level. And that's the segue into this chapter, is that sea level has a sea level. And if the river water, the fresh water, goes below that, the salt water starts to go upstream. Basically, it starts to move level wise as far up as it can go. So that is the problem. As we've taken major rivers and dredged them for navigation purposes, we have created a level below sea level, effectively, and then we cross our fingers that the freshwater river water coming downstream, coming on the Mississippi, or in this case where I was, Omaha is right between Iowa and Nebraska. The Missouri River feeds into the Mississippi, so it's kind of, they said don't go swimming in the Missouri, but certainly the Mississippi is a huge navigable waterway for sure. So this is the case in the situation. So when ocean water moves upstream, where normally fresh water exists, you now have the corrosive actions of the saline, the salt, impacting systems, whether those are ecological systems like the grasses and the marshes and the fish and all that that are freshwater, or it's human-made systems and farms and so forth, or it's human-made systems, which is the water treatment plants, shipping and boats and things that are not designed to be, working through salt water. That's just the simple of it. So here's the details of it, and so you don't want to have, you want to have plants and things that can possibly manage both as barriers. And there's things about that. I think we've got some case examples of that here as well too. But basically, here's the paragraph that talks about what happens when you have salt water. Nutrients get unlocked and so forth, and then the chemistry changes, and excess algae growth can come up, and then that sucks up all the oxygen, and oxygen kills the fish and so forth. So here's in 2023, just a couple of years ago, that exact situation happened that I described. There were drought conditions in the Midwest on the Mississippi. The water level fell below sea level, and so therefore the ocean water started to move upstream. And this is your declaration in Louisiana, in emergency declaration 3600. Covering 4 counties, and for category B work. So that is emergency protective measures, right? And what did they do for that and that sort of thing. And so there's your details there. And this is the technical side of it, and what the engineering work. They had already started doing some work on the Army Corps. Towards this, they had to increase that, is what it amounts to, and keep going further in depth and in distance. So there are saltwater intrusion. This doesn't only happen in the US. That's a quiz question as well. It can happen anywhere, so it is not a hazard limited to the United States. That is true. And there's I have cases and examples here from Australia, China, Italy, and so forth, all over, and countries in Europe as well too. And there's some papers that have information if you're looking for side-by-side comparisons and things like that. You can find that analysis at the end of this chapter. So it's a pretty simple, as I said, short chapter. Here's our impacts by ESF. What happens at the potable waters and the recreation. It's pretty obvious, I hope by now, for what these impacts would be. On the recovery side, you could have issues if you had water impacting the health and social services. Certainly, if the hospital was nearby the river, and there's a number of VA centers or assisted living care that might be drawing water directly from the river, and if that suddenly becomes salt water, then that's the challenge and the problem. Certainly the economic impacts, if you have to shut down a water treatment plant, a nuclear power plant, if you have to cut out fishing or recreational activities or other agricultural impacts. There's a lot of things with the recovery support functions if saltwater gets to where it's not supposed to due to inundation. And of course, the natural cultural resources, as we've always noted before. And then on the community lifelines, here's some examples of those, as I mentioned. And again, the energy, the normal power grid and stuff like that, and trucking of fuel, rail transport, not affected unless it is something that utilizes the river, and then the salt water, and the fresh water of the river, I should say. And then if the saltwater inundation is a concern, that's where it could hit the energy sector. And again, I don't see this as a transportation issue except for the maritime side of it. And then, of course, it's a massive impact to water systems if the potable water supply is pulling from where salt water is now, and it should have been fresh water. So here's the basics on our four-phase cycles. Pretty simple stuff as well too. Generally, hopefully this is a short-term set of response, but again, the mitigation efforts and the recovery could be long for this, based on what happens to the different sectors. And then here's our planning, our POETE process, similar to the other types of things. Interestingly, if there's underwater sills or other decontamination that needs to be added in and it got corroded, replacing that equipment, all of that could be a factor. Also, if you have to add tracking and monitoring system tied to, for example, your water, river water level, your river gauges, I should say, if those need to be replaced with ones that can be worked through saltwater as well as freshwater, that's a form of equipment that needs to be worked through for this particular hazard. And then running this through as an exercise would be a really good idea. What happens if, kind of a thing? What happens if the Delaware got inundated with seawater? What happens if the Hudson got? What happens if they both at the same time? Those are the ways to run this in New Jersey, for example. And then here's our notes and our additional reading, as I mentioned. So there's some dam implications, cases for other countries, as I mentioned before as well too. And then here's the bibliography. So that's 17. Last on the chapters, and again, another short one, is 18, which is ice dams and frozen major lakes. So this one, as I showed in the case with Mackinac Island, but the idea here is that these are a frozen major lake is just that. It's something that ends up becoming something that you can literally drive over. So we're not talking about small Bud Lake or anything like that in New Jersey. This is the Great Lakes and some of the other things. The ice dams issue we covered in the threat portion, and as well as in chapter 10 when we talked about too much ice dam. So the term ice dam can have two different meanings, but that detail and descriptions are there in the forward part. But we jump right into case examples. And the first one is Denison's Ice Road in Canada. So they would carve a 320-mile road over frozen lakes in northern Canada. I think if you've watched the TV show Ice Road Truckers, that's what we're talking about here. So the key to this is that a lot of these things, a lot of these roads are done for movement of economics. This is to move goods, building supplies, fuel, right? Other things that are just too expensive to ship by air. The other thing too is that if somebody has an accident or something like that, this may be the only way to get someone from point A to point B. So medical transportation, quiz question, is something that ice roads can be used for. So that's the thing. You think about this part of Canada with the winds blowing and the whiteout situations with a lot of snow and all that. You may not be able to get a helicopter in. So it sort of a truck or ambulance type situation is what it may take to move somebody who's injured or whatever, transport from a medical perspective. Here's our case from Mackinac Island. So year-round on Mackinac Island in Michigan, there's about 500 people, but during the tourist season, it can rise to over 16,000. Again, I mentioned there's no bridge from any parts of anywhere, and there is a ferry service and a small private airfield, but that ferry during the wintertime, because of the ice and the possible heavy ice flow or a complete icing over of Lake Michigan, you can't run the ferry. So they create ice bridges for most of the cases. And just recently, they have built some semi-permanent type structures that can be moved out in the event of an emergency, if they had to do an emergency evacuation of the island, kind of a thing. I think some of the details might be in the footnotes. I think that's the changes in their master plan number 9, the need for emergency bridge. I believe that is in progress if it's not completed. At the time I was writing the book, it was a plan, and I think they had funded it, but they hadn't implemented it. So it's something I'd have to go and check and see where they're at. But the idea of an emergency bridge is something they've been thinking about for years, and I think they've finally gotten around to doing it. So next up is our adverse impacts to the ESFs and the RSFs. So again, transportation safety, ESF 1 is certainly impacted from ice bridges and frozen major lakes, I should say. And then, of course, if there's an ice dam that's coming up onto a bridge, like some of the ones that we've talked about in the past in the Trenton area on the Delaware River, if the bridge has to be closed, that's a transportation issue. It's an ESF1 impact. And of course, it's a public works in engineering if the bridge gets damaged. So similar type thing. And then again, as I mentioned, medical transportation routes might be involving those ice roads as well. And then of course, if ice dams cause rivers to overflow, if frozen lakes are impacted because of too thick or too thin ice, that could have impacts on fishing and other agricultural and natural resources. And then again, that cross-sector business and infrastructure, ESF 14. Again, over in Canada, the that commercial trucking aspects are huge relative to the continuous running or operation of those ice roads. If they become unusable, then you have a cross-sector business impact. Here's that picture of Mackinac Island. Again, the color one may be a little bit better to look at. And then here's our recovery support functions. If you have commercial maritime on a navigable river, if there's ice dams or ice flows, certainly that's an issue. And the reverse is true on the ground transportation over ice roads. If there isn't enough ice, then to support the vehicles, then that's the problem. And similarly, health, social, and other impacts that I mentioned in the ESFs are applicable from the RSF perspective as well too. And then finally, in the community lifelines, these run along the same lines as both the ESFs and the RSFs. It's interesting. I wrote in here, ice roads are not normally used for medical transportation, but certainly the fail. I'm gonna have to look back at that question and see what I said. Give me 1 second here. So I thought I had written that as a true thing. Let's see. Yeah, I'm gonna have to look at that. Yeah, just go with ice roads are normally used for medical transportation is true. I have to look at why I have that. I think I wrote the quiz question wrong for that. But anyway, and then here's our impacts to the disaster phase cycles, similarly to the other ones. Do know that the U.S. National Weather Service has a river ice spotter program. This is volunteers can help spot ice jams or dams in rivers and report them the same way there's a severe weather, thunderstorm spotter, tornado spotter type things, et cetera. There's a river ice spotter program that the NWS has out there. It is a river ice spotter. That's the part about the quiz. In terms of a question. So there may be unique hazards for ice dams and frozen major lakes. They may or may not get an ICS structure. If something happens, it may just be dealt with by one agency or two agencies and not have the sort of multiple unified command structure or it's all the stuff that we think of when we talk about the other whole of government, whole of community type incidents. Some of this may just be a simple public health type aspect when it comes to emergency medical services, or the Department of Transportation might have vehicles that then can pull a truck off of an ice road, and then it's not to the level of generating an incident command system, full ICS structure. Here's our impact to the POETE process, and noting that those countries where there are frozen lakes near the Arctic Peninsula should have deliberative planning for ice road failures. That's pretty obvious for planning. And then the rest goes through this as well too. Again, reminding you that the GIS systems are good for managing intelligence around ice dams and frozen major lakes. That's something frozen major rivers, something to look at for monitoring where those ice flows are, how much the water level is backing up behind the ice, potentially even what kind of pressure the bridge can take. All that kind of stuff is valuable intelligence for command to have. And then the training and other things are very similar to the other complex issues. Just looking at this as another case set of things to work through. And then here's our notes. Here's that. Okay, so let's see. Okay, here's the river ice spotter. Looks like it's possible that they moved it. I mean, sometimes these things on the National Weather Service are first come up in one National Weather Service weather station. Like this one happens to be the Buffalo, New York site that has this information. I don't know if there's one of these in Upton or in Mount Holly, but this is an example of it in how to volunteer in the forums and stuff like that. So if one of the links is broken, just try doing what I just did, put in the term, and then it might find another spot for it on the National Weather Service. I get the feeling some of these websites are going through a lot of changes right now. So I'll just say that without being too politically incorrect. All right, and then the rest is the references, additional readings I would recommend. This Denison's Ice Road is a pretty good story, kind of a thing. And then, wow, this one really stretched out. Wilson Center above the permafrost line, winter roads. You can see how that one works as well too. So, and that's it for the book chapters. I'll take a minute or two if anybody has any other questions or comments, and then we can kind of review the potential quiz questions. And I'll stop sharing at this point. Okay, cool. All right, so if I were to ask, which of the following four things impacts the severity of tropical storms? Harmful algae bloom, coastal water temperature, road salt, or mountain terrain? Anyone can shout it out. Okay, that would be coastal water temperature. And then a MEOW stands for what? Is it minimum envelope of water, minimum expanse of water, maximum expanse of water, or maximum envelope of water? That's the last one, maximum envelope of water. And then if a wind from a tropical storm pulls water away from the shoreline, this is known as negative storm surges. Think about it, it's just the opposite of whatever it would be. So it's not positive storm surges, and it's certainly not nightly storm surges or equatorial storm surges. It's negative storm surges. So significant wave heights or high seas are a blank of the largest waves. Many individual waves will probably be higher, and that is not the minimum or the maximum or the peak, but the average. So significant wave heights. I believe that was in our tropical storm chapter. That's the average of the largest waves. And then from Superstorm Sandy in 2012, the question is how many states were adversely impacted? You can write this down on a piece of paper somewhere, and it was 24. Now, not all of those got presidential declarations, but there were 24 states impacted. What threat generally generates tsunamis? The answer to that is earthquakes. Now, humans cannot blank an earthquake or tsunami. Sounds like match game. But they can blank the adverse impacts to other humans from them. So if it was prepare, avoid, protect, or prevent, the answer would be prevent. Humans cannot prevent an earthquake or tsunami, but they can prevent the adverse impacts to other humans from them. Everything else doesn't read well if you just put the words in, basically. So of the A letter states with the beginning letter A, which US state is also subject to tsunami risks? If your choice is Arizona, Alabama, Arkansas, or Alaska, the answer is Alaska. What process at a water treatment plant can have both potential positives and negatives and needs to be monitored and secured? And that answer is chlorination. As we talked about before, too much, too little, certainly positives and negatives. Oxidation is not a process that needs to be positives and negatives in monitored and secured, nor does solar power, but it's chlorination is the answer. On a smaller scale, and for many isolated communities, what may be an effective method of decontamination of raw water to make it potable or drinkable? And the answer to that is not road salt or chlorination, because again, small scale, you won't have the ability to do chlorination, but the answer is ultraviolet or UV light. And again, as I said earlier today in Oregon, they recommend families keep how many gallons of water per person to support themselves for up to 2 weeks? You can write this number down, and it is 14 gallons. Not 2, not 100, not 4. Staff from a water treatment plant and or wastewater treatment plant should be considered as blank to a community's unified command, UC, as part of their incident command team, and that is liaison officers, LNOs. That's something that's been a running theme on this. They're not telecom, they're not natural resource officers. Actually, natural resource recovery officers. I think I made up that term. They are LNOs, liaison officers. That Albuquerque-Barillo County Water Utility Authority provided naturally occurring arsenic removal, something else, aquifer recharge, surface water treatment, and other elements to benefit this community. Again, it's an open book quiz, so if you just put in arsenic removal, the next phrase you'll hear, or see, I should say, not hear, you'll read is fish passage. So that's what they did. They provided this fish passage support in their project that they did. Public information officers, PIOs, need to indicate what when describing potable water being made available to the public during incidents at designated points of distribution. And this is that thing I mentioned a couple of times already. Size, container, and quantity. How much are you going to get? How big is the container? And how much can I potentially carry? What kind of container does it coming in, I should say. If the answer is no container, then I need to know that so I can bring a container with me. It's not the wind speed or the brand and flavor of water. And it doesn't matter where that was, whether it was purchased or donated. A community-based boil water alert can require what at the impacted healthcare facilities? So if this were to happen at a healthcare facility, a boil water alert, this would not add visitors. It would not increase scheduling of elective operations. It would actually generate massive protocol changes. So lots of things bad happen if they have a boil water alert at a healthcare facility. It's not a positive thing. Storm surges or high tides can also move salt water into blank areas. And the answer to that is agricultural. So the stormwater doesn't move into, I should say, the storm surges or high tides doesn't move salt water, does not move salt water into a mountain or the ocean. It moves potentially into agricultural areas. That's where the threat is from an agricultural perspective, is that now salt water is going where we were expecting fresh water. And if the plants are not able to manage that, if they're not the kind of plants that can handle both fresh water and salt water, they're going to be adversely impacted. In 2023, 4 parishes in Louisiana received what because of an adverse impact of water treatment plant capability due to saltwater intrusion resulting from low water levels on the Mississippi River. They didn't get a presidential declaration. Sorry, they didn't get a presidential disaster declaration. They didn't get assistance from the United Nations, and they didn't get assistance from the World Health Organization. They got a presidential emergency declaration, an EM declaration. So that's, again, if you follow the book chapter, you'll see that it was an EM in Louisiana, an emergency declaration. So saltwater intrusion is not a hazard limited to the United States. That is true. The restoration of recreation activities, including boating and fishing, from saltwater contamination of the river, streams, and surrounding land impacts which recovery support function? Is it infrastructure systems, community systems, housing? No, it's natural and cultural resources. So that's an easy one. When we're talking about boating and fishing and other sort of natural and cultural type things to do, that's the natural and cultural resources recovery support function. The geospatial intelligence systems, or GIS, used to track, monitor, and evaluate the emergency management intelligence around saltwater inundation monitoring is also a form of what? And I think I mentioned this a couple of times today in the chapter. It's a form of equipment. So it's not the planning, it's not the training or the exercising, but GIS systems are equipment. Mackinac Island is an example of a location which can be surrounded by a frozen major lake. Has a challenge with what emergency management action? And it's not that they have a challenge with sheltering in place or doing a lockdown or feeding. They have a challenge with evacuation. As the blank happens, the stability, consistency of thick ice upon which truck transportation is driven, has become riskier. So the answer to this one is, as temperatures rise, the stability and consistency of thick ice upon which truck transportation is driven has become riskier. So if temperatures rise, the ice becomes thinner. Not temperatures decline, temperatures stabilize, or temperatures are anything the same. Just simple. With the warming of the temperatures causes thick ice to have a problem. Pretty simple stuff. As I said before, I think I have this one wrong in the thing. So the answer is true for ice road. To get the question right, the answer is true for ice roads are normally used for medical transportation. I'll try to fix that in the next version of this. A lack of blank delivery can impact the energy community lifeline if failures in ice roads are key transportation modalities. And if the choices are machine parts, food, or telecom service, an impact to the energy community would be fuel. And then finally, the National Weather Service has a blank program where people can voluntarily report ice jams or ice dams. And the answer to that is river ice spotters. I just showed you that a second ago. So it's not storm spotter or severe weather spotter or snow spotter, but river ice spotter. So that is pretty much the quiz. Again, it's covering chapters, I believe it's 14, 15, 16, 17, and 18. A lot of chapters, but again, those last ones we covered today are all pretty short. And hopefully these are fairly logical things. It is, again, an open book quiz. It's going to open up at 9:30 today, and it'll be open up through May 5th, I believe. It's basically a full week, as we've done on all the other quizzes before. So next week is cyber, and that's what we'll cover then. I think we'll talk a little bit about the eval. And again, if anybody's interested in doing either the paper or the presentation, or both, drop me an email or get me on this Telegraph thing, a quick note, and I will happily help you craft whatever you need to have to get those done. Those again are optional. We haven't we're just trying this out to see, and I'm happy to help you get them put forth to either a journal for the article or the NJEMA for a presentation, possibly at one of their training sessions. Again, no promises on either, but the idea is that help you craft them if that's something you want to do. You may or may not need those for CEM or AEM from the IAEM or the NJCEM from the NJEMA. There's a list of acronyms for you. So the professional contributions each would count separately, I believe, for all three of those credentials. So other than that, that's what I have for this week. And if there's any other questions, drop them in. Otherwise, we'll see you guys. Let me just double check what we're doing quickly. Look at my calendar for next week. I think, yeah, we don't have class next Monday because it's Cinco de Mayo. I thought maybe people might be out and about. So our class is Tuesday. So the last week 13, I should say, the last session of the book, chapter 19, is on Tuesday the 6th. So just a reminder. I'll probably put something in the Telegram system just to remind folks about that as well too. But it's no special Sunday session, but we'll meet again on Tuesday, 7 o'clock Eastern. Other than that, thanks very much, and we'll see you guys next week.
Thanks, Mike.
Take care.
you.